All right. Good morning, everybody. Let's talk about the jobs tax. The cost of living is already unbearable for many families. People are working harder, but taking home less. And now Labour has made it worse. Their jobs tax is yet another betrayal, another attack on the people who keep this country going. Before the election, Labour promised they wouldn't raise taxes on working people. They looked the British public in the eye and said, trust us. But now they've broken that promise in the worst way. This is a fundamental breach of trust. They hiked taxes on farmers. They introduced a jobs tax that is killing businesses. They even snatched away pensioners' winter fuel payments, despite their promise to protect them. And who is paying the price? You are. Even the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility is clear. Labour's jobs tax will hit workers, not just businesses. And the real cost? By the end of this Parliament, families across Britain will be £3,500 worse off. That is not a small cut. That's food on the table. That's energy bills. That's rent or a mortgage payment. Labour ministers think this is pocket money. Just this morning, the Prime Minister was boasting that he had given people a pay rise. He does not get it. Why are we in this mess? Because Labour simply do not understand how the economy works. They think government creates growth. It doesn't. Business does. Businesses create wealth, which means more money in the pockets of workers and more money for public services. Without business, there is no growth and there are no jobs. And yet, instead of helping businesses, Labour is hammering them with a £25 billion tax rate. The result of the jobs tax? Lower wages, fewer jobs, and more businesses going under. The evidence is clear. The OBR shows that the vast majority of the jobs tax will be passed on to workers in lower wages, and this will lose an average family over £3,500. It'll mean more businesses collapsing. Tesco, Sainsbury's, Sky, Stellantis, they're cutting staff. And a Bank of England survey found that 54% of businesses now expect lower employment. Lower employment means that the problem is going to get worse as fewer people earn a living. The response from Labour ministers just this morning is that people shouldn't be so pessimistic. They might as well say, suck it up. The jobs tax is hitting so many. It's hitting part-time work. Businesses now face extra costs for hiring part-time staff. And it means cuts to vital services, schools, councils, and healthcare. The jobs tax hits pharmacies, GP surgeries, children's hospices. Labour refused to exempt them despite our calls. This is what happens when you punish business. You don't just hurt CEOs and boardrooms, you hurt ordinary working people. The most frustrating thing is that this was not inevitable. It did not have to happen. We warned them, businesses warned them, and yet Labour refused to listen. Now it's working families who will suffer. This jobs tax is a tax on your pay packet, a tax on those who work hard, do the right thing, and want a better future for their children. I know what it is like to struggle to get by, to make ends meet, to have to make difficult decisions because I was worried about money, to have to choose between eating or taking the bus. I cannot imagine losing £3,500 at a time when people are trying to save for deposits, pay mortgages, deal with soaring bills. Under Labour, from today, household bills will shoot up by over £1,000 this year alone. And don't just take my word for it. Business leaders are speaking out. Over 200 major restaurants, pubs and hotels have warned Labour that their budget will cost jobs. Over 80 retail leaders have warned that it will slow pay growth, cause shop closures. Even some of Labour's own business backers now feel betrayed. Because their approach isn't just economic mismanagement, it's economic vandalism. The Conservative Party is under new leadership. We did not always get everything right, but fundamentally, we as a party believe in lower taxes and better public services. We believe in the people who built businesses from nothing to give back to their communities. We believe in the people who took risks, tried something new, and built a legacy for the next generation. Labour don't understand what it means to take a risk, to meet a payroll, to grow an enterprise. Most of Labour's cabinet have barely worked for a business, let alone built one. They have no idea about the hard graft it takes to run small business. To them, national insurance is just another line item on a budget page. They are so busy spending other people's money that they don't think about the impact of their decisions on those who are working hard, taking risks, and trying to get on with their lives. The result? Lower growth, lower wages, lost jobs. Labour did not listen to business. Will they listen to the families now paying the price? Because if they don't fix this, we will. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kemi. Labour said at the election they would not raise national insurance. And Rachel Reeves has repeatedly claimed that she is not raising taxes on working people. She said so just last week. The analysis we are setting out today lays bare the truth of this matter. Working people are worse off under Labour. The Chancellor's job tax will cost working families £3,500 over the course of this Parliament. This is based on numbers taken directly from the government's own independent forecaster, the Office for Budget Responsibility. So let me set out how that figure is calculated. The OBR produced estimates for how much revenue will be raised by the jobs tax in each financial year up to 2029-30. From those figures, we have subtracted the amounts which the OBR says will be needed to compensate public sector employers to give a net revenue figure. We have then applied to this the OBR's estimates for how much of the cost is passed through to workers each year in the form of lower wages, which from next year onwards is 76%. When that total reduction in wages is divided across all working households, the result is a cost of just over £3,500 for every working family in this country. That official OBR analysis is published in black and white for all to see. They are clear that they expect the majority of the cost to be borne ultimately by workers through their pay packets. And the Bank of England have come to the same conclusion. This was a particularly bad tax to increase because of the ripple effects it has across the whole economy. It is not just lower wages. Employers are being forced to shed jobs, hike up prices, or shelve investment plans to cope with the costs. It is a ticking tax time bomb due to detonate in just 5 days' time. And it will have a disproportionate impact on specific groups and sectors, especially because Labour have chosen to slash the threshold for paying employer NICs as well as increasing the rate. That means lower paid and part-time workers, disproportionately likely to be young and to be women, are hit the hardest. And sectors which rely on those workers or are particularly labour intensive bear the brunt of the cost. That includes retail, hospitality and leisure businesses, sectors which are also seeing their business rates bills rise today by 140%. The impact on our high streets could be devastating. Retailers, including Sainsbury's, Tesco and Morrisons, have already responded by cutting staff. And Hospitality UK estimate 750,000 jobs will be dragged into the tax net in their sector alone. These costs come on top of a litany of other extra burdens being imposed on businesses all at once. And it comes at a time of huge uncertainty around trade, around our national defence, and the implications for inflation and interest rates. Our economy is in a fragile position when it comes to weathering those headrooms, thanks to the crippling burdens imposed on businesses and households by this Labour government. Working families will pay the price for all of this. While the jobs tax eats away at their pay packets, Labour are also stoking inflation. Today's bills have risen for millions of families by more than £1,000. That, of course, affects pensioners too, who face rising energy bills while winter fuel payments have been snatched away. Another broken promise. The OBR now expect inflation this year to be more than double their estimate at the last Conservative budget in March of last year. And as both they and the Bank of England have said, government policy is directly contributing to the rising cost of living, both via their reckless borrowing spree and via the costs imposed through their tax rises. And higher inflation also means higher interest rates hitting mortgage holders. Labour wants you to believe their tax rises are not hitting working people, that they are magically absorbed by businesses with no knock-on impacts on the people they employ or the things that they sell. The reality is families face a double hit from this Labour government, lower incomes thanks to the jobs tax and higher prices as well. We will all end up poorer thanks to their mismanagement and broken promises. We simply cannot afford Labour.
Right, I have questions from the media, and first up is Andy Bell from Channel 5.
Thank you very much. Andy Bell, 5 News. The government says that much of the money raised from the rise in national insurance for employers is going into investment in the NHS. What would you do? Would you not put that money into the NHS, or how would you raise the money otherwise? Are there specific taxes you would raise? Are there specific cuts you would make? What would you do?
Well, the first thing is that we would not have created a budget that caused so much crisis. We invested more than ever in the NHS when we were in government. But the fact is, what they're going to do is not going to increase investment in the NHS because people are going to lose their jobs. If people lose their jobs, people are paid lower wages, they're paying lower tax, and that's the thing that is going to create the crisis that Mel and I are talking about. So we're not setting a budget for an election that's 4 years out. We had a budget last year. The OBR showed that people would be better off. We have also had a manifesto where we talked about what we were doing. We lost that election. Right now, our job is opposition, to show Labour what they need to do in order to grow the economy. Taxing businesses is not going to grow the economy and will not get the investment in public services. Mel, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that's absolutely right, Kemi. We would have taken different choices on tax and spending and certainly on borrowing as well, which would have kept interest rates low and the economy in a better place. We would have focused far more on productivity. We had a Labour government that came in and gave train drivers 14%, junior doctors 22%, no strings attached, no requirement for greater productivity. And we would have gone further and in a more principled way on welfare reform.
Chris Hope, GB News.
Thank you. Kemi Badenoch, today's a big day in the world of Donald Trump. We're going to be seeing tariffs imposed probably on the UK later today. What would be your approach to that? Would you impose tariffs back on the US? And why have you reportedly told your MPs they can't criticise the US president?
I haven't told my MPs that they can't say that, so that's just false. But on the point of trade tariffs, we should not be engaging in a trade war or tit-for-tat retaliation. That makes everybody poorer. What I would do is what I said, my very first Prime Minister's questions, that we need a UK-US trade deal ASAP. This was something that we were, well on the way to negotiating. The last time President Trump was in government, President Biden did not want to negotiate any free trade agreements with any country, so we had to pause that. You need a willing partner for trade agreements. But now is the time for us to kickstart that and move at speed. And it has to be something that delivers for those critical sectors. It can't just be something that looks at AI and tech. What are we doing for our car manufacturers, for example? When I was business secretary, we spent a lot of money investing in the car industry. We had people who were creating jobs. Stellantis, for example, now cutting jobs. If those tariffs come into place, let's look at the £8 billion of exports that UK manufacturers, car manufacturers sell to the US. We're not going to get that amount of money, which means that the tax take will reduce. That's a problem for the Chancellor because she's going to have to look elsewhere for the taxes. So this needs to be solved as soon as possible. It is not something that can be ignored. Shihab Khan, ITV.
Shihab Khan, ITV News. Just in that answer just there, you appear to be quite critical of tariffs generally, and that you are against them, saying that you won't retaliate if the Trump administration introduces them. Will you therefore be critical of the Trump administration for introducing them onto the UK?
Oh, I have been already. I'm a former trade secretary. Tariffs are not good for global economies. We are a trading nation. We're an island nation. Tariffs are terrible for us. But there's a big difference between criticizing policy and criticizing an individual. My job is not to go out attacking leaders of foreign countries. My job is to talk about what works for the UK national interest. Tariffs are not good for national interest. And there's no difficulty in saying that at all. Ben Wright, BBC.
But if the US does slap tariffs on the UK, if Donald Trump doesn't give the security guarantee for Ukraine that the Prime Minister is desperate to have, is it time for Britain to change its strategy, to get much tougher on Donald Trump?
Well, let's be clear on what the strategy is first. It's not clear what the strategy is. But who pays if we put tariffs on the US? We will pay, because it means that the things they're selling us become more expensive. They don't pay that. I believe that everything we do should be in the national interest. Making life more expensive for British consumers so that we can thumb our nose at Donald Trump is not the right way. We need to make sure that we keep the cost of living as low as possible for the British public. That's absolutely critical. Now, does that mean that we should just do whatever they say and accept whatever happens? No. But you ask what I'm going to do. I am the leader of the opposition. We need to ask what the Prime Minister is going to do. He had a press conference with President Trump. It was supposed to have gone well, but so far we're not seeing the positive impact in the UK, and that needs fixing. Beth Rigby.
You say Labour's decisions since the election have broken voters' trust, and you also say that Labour don't understand the economy. But do you acknowledge that the cost of living crisis did start under the former Conservative government, that Liz Truss's mini-budget destroyed your party's reputation on economic credibility, and that the tax burden for the UK was at a 70-year high when the Conservatives left office? How can you now turn around your own reputation on the economy? And do you think the public are listening to you? And just quickly on tariffs, everything you've said today seems to chime with what the Prime Minister is actually trying to do, i.e. no retaliatory tariffs immediately, trying at pace to arrange this economic deal, which he talked about this morning. So on this, at least, you're shoulder to shoulder with him and agree with him. Thank you.
So you ask about Labour not being trusted, but that we're in the same position. Our reputation was not built in the last few years. It was built over many decades, I would say centuries. The Conservative Party is the party of business. You look at our shadow cabinet. Many of us have started business, listed businesses. We've worked in the private sector. You cannot compare that with Labour, where most of them have never run a business and not even worked in the private sector. So we get it. And at the end of the day, Rishi Sunak was the last Prime Minister. And he left Keir Starmer an economy that was the fastest growing in the G7. All of that is gone. We're not saying that there weren't difficult times under the Conservatives. The debt burden you're talking about has happened because of COVID. Everybody remembers a pandemic that for nearly 2 years locked us all up at home. That needed to be paid for. But now, when the green shoots were coming through, Labour has done something that is really destructive, and we cannot run away from that. They need to face up to what they're doing. They're making life harder for everyone else. They're making life harder and more expensive, and that needs to be fixed. On tariffs, if the Prime Minister does not want to put retaliatory tariffs on, I think that's excellent. That is the right thing to do. Where he does the right thing, we will agree. But where he does the wrong thing, we will disagree, and we will provide constructive criticism. That's my job, and that's what I'm doing. Thank you. Aubrey Allegretti.
Thank you. Aubrey Allegretti from The Times. I'm just curious to know whether you have personally spoken to any senior Republicans and urged them to spare Britain from the tariffs that are set to come into force later this week. I mean, you've obviously met JD Vance before. Have you personally spoken to him to encourage him not to? And on the subject of a US trade deal, which you're also very keen on, do you think it's time, for example, for the UK to drop its opposition to things like hormone-injected beef and chlorinated chicken that we know have been the big sticking points on this for many years? Thank you.
So no, I'm not cutting across what the government is doing. When I was in government, finding out the people in the opposition were trying to undermine the work that was happening was, it was not the way to go about doing it. What we do is we speak publicly about what we want to see happen and help the government course correct. On a US trade deal, it's not true that the sticking points have been hormone-fed beef, etc. This is what gets whipped up in the press and by campaign groups. The sticking points will be actually far more fundamental. It's always been about quotas, how much an industry can withstand. With all the trade deals that we dealt with, we made sure that our SPS standards were always at the highest level. But nobody is going to be forced to eat chlorinated chicken. I don't even think most chicken in the US is actually washed with chlorine. This is it's a myth that has expanded quite a lot over the years. Things have changed. We need to focus on what's actually in a trade deal. And no one has seen what is being discussed in the trade deal. We're hearing things about digital services tax. My experience, having done these things, I concluded the UK's biggest trade deal, the CPTPP, is that as much as possible, they need to make sure that they are looking after UK national interests, not giving things away, and making sure that the public can see what the benefit is going to be to them, not focus on things that are largely irrelevant, that don't belong in trade deals. And I'm holding out hope that the government does that for all our sakes. We need it. Jason Gross.
Thank you. The OBR's forecast last week suggests they think that growth is going to bounce back a bit next year. The way you guys are talking this morning, it sounds like you're worried about job cuts, inflation. I mean, do you think have the forecasters got this one right, or do you think the government is, given all the headwinds that we've got at the moment, that they are risking a recession here?
Well, what the OBR have said is that the price of the tax will be paid for in lower wages. But we don't just speak to forecasters, we speak to the businesses. We speak to the people who are doing the hiring, and this is what they're telling us. There was a business that I visited during the election that is closed down because it says it can't take anymore. I mean, Mel, you can say a little bit more about where the evidence is coming from, but we can see it all in all our lives. The bills that are going up are not fiction, they're not a forecast, they're not a model. We can look out there and see what's happening. Mel?
Yeah, so I think on growth, the OBR has been very clear that for this year it will be half, 2 to 1%. That is a huge reduction in growth. The question then is, why has this happened? Well, it's not because under us we had COVID that shrank the economy by 10% and we had to do the things to get us through that. It's not because we had a that started and visited inflation to our shores that we then had to bring down. This is because of the choices that this Chancellor took. And she chose to put up taxes on businesses, which is what we're discussing today, with disastrous consequences. She chose to talk down the British economy, and we saw the results of that in the confidence surveys through time. She chose to go out and borrow huge amounts of money in a spending splurge, which is a fiscal loosening that was inflationary and required a monetary response of increased interest rates, which both dampened down the animal spirits and put up the cost of business investment, but at the same time critically meant that the servicing costs on our debt rose very significantly and ultimately wiped out her entire headroom against the fiscal targets. So I think where we are at the moment, albeit that she's rebuilt that headroom with taking further difficult choices, given the kind of headwinds that the economy now is likely to face in the future, is in a very fragile position. And those headwinds include perhaps having to spend even more on defence going forward, depending on what happens geopolitically in the world, and a lot of other challenges that are coming our way, including the underlying productivity assumptions in the OBR forecasts, for example, which may not come to pass.
Thank you, Mel. Dan Martin, Daily Telegraph.
Hi. The US State Department has expressed free speech concerns around our laws relating to abortion buffer zones. Is that something you'd like to see reviewed to get a better trade deal?
I had a question on this morning when I was on LBC. And one of the things that we have to keep emphasizing is that we do have free speech in this country, but it is under threat. It is under threat because people are overinterpreting, and we need to make sure that we don't lose our free speech civil liberties. I think that some of the things that the US State Department is commenting on is actually more commentary rather than reality. But one of the things I do not want to see is us bringing the abortion wars that the US has to our country. We never had this before. We don't need that. The State Department should recognize that this is a free country that has liberal values, people in our country have freedom. I don't know how exactly the interpretation for what happened to that lady did occur. I remember when we had votes in Parliament, I thought that we were too onerous in what we were doing around buffer zones. But at the end of the day, that's what Parliament voted for. And we need to respect what Parliament votes for. It was a free vote. If Parliament votes for something, then we need to recognise that those are democratically, that those are laws that have come in democratically, and respect that. But we have to be vigilant. I am not pretending that everything is fine. We have free speech in the country, but we must protect it, and we must make sure that there is no overreach. All right, I think that concludes the questions. Thank you very much, everybody. Good to see you, and see you again soon.